The levels are absolutely gargantuan. Let me illustrate this by showing you the third level, the Tian Shan River, where Indy is hunting for a Buddhist temple that might contain one of the machine pieces. You start off in a snowy valley and have to do some platforming in order to make your way up to a Soviet base. You then thrust into a firefight with the guards. Once they're dead, you have to head inside the building and crawl through vents in order to find a raft and make your way down the river, which functions a little like an obstacle course. Back on dry land, you then have to make your way up to a locked gate that requires 4 ancient candles in order to open. To find them, you have to head down the other side of the mountain, find more Soviets along the way, and then use the raft to escape the river maze that has 4 separate parts, which each lead to a unique puzzle that houses other candles. Some are just working out the correct spot to lead to your prize, but others are lengthy sequences.
If I had made more content switching through the custom stage, that would get me 1,000 subscribers somehow. But if I do the shorts are what gets me the views. And then I sort of like described to someone in Brooklyn. I'm not in Brooklyn, but I had seen photographs and stuff for relatives that live close by that they have their own like radio station thing where they, I don't know if they had wrote to people saying that this guy wasn't a serial killer. Like, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that they wrote to them saying that I did stuff that somehow I couldn't get away with in real life. I haven't been scrutinized.
It's a fantastic level in the second half, set on a Soviet frigate, and it starts out with Jones in the brig, having to break out and sneak around without any of his equipment. Once you do recover it, the pace then shifts and it becomes an all-out firefight as you race around the ship looking for items to unlock the different decks and fix up a lifeboat so you can escape. Similarly, there's a short level called Jeep Track, which, funnily enough, is based entirely around driving a Jeep, and it is hilariously bonkers. You're blasting over ramps, running down Soviets, and even donutting down into a pit, like some sort of crazed 1950s rally driver. And everything ends with a Jeep-on-Jeep duel as you hunt for the level exit. The problem is in the more traditional platforming puzzle-solving levels, where thanks to their complexity, they can often become quite a slog to play through. The Shambhala Monastery is the worst example, and is guilty of some absurdly obtuse design. The goal is to summon the guardian of the monastery, and in order to do that, you have to ring a large bell by activating a golden statuette that shuffles along a track and strikes the instrument. Sounds simple enough? Well, it's very much not. First, you have to climb down into the bowels of the monastery and complete a sequence of instant death jumps in order to reactivate the tower's machinery. Then it's back up the instant death platforms, where you have to solve a puzzle that has you pulling levers in one tower, running over to the other, and then pulling a different lever at the exact moment that the clock hands on the floor hit the hour mark, which finally activates the statue. Now, none of this is signposted well, and for me, it resulted in a huge amount of aimless wandering and pressing switches, until I ended up ringing the bell by sheer luck. That desire to create levels with real depth and scale to them is nothing to sneer at, and when it works, it creates some very memorable gameplay. But the problem is that in the moments when it's not working, Infernal Machine can be pretty unpleasant. Now, that might sound like a big downside, but unfortunately, it isn't the worst thing about Infernal Machine. It is a very janky game, and suffers not only from some wonky controls, but a really loose grip on the hardware. Considering how fundamental platforming is to the Infernal Machine formula, jumping and climbing feel very underbaked, and it's clear from the first level that neither Barwood nor Factor 5 really knew what they were doing. Much like in Tomb Raider, you have to combine sequences of large forward leaps and vertical ledge grabbing. But unlike Lara Croft, Indy has to be dead straight to grab hold of anything, and this results in a ludicrous amount of deaths from being just slightly off target. Similarly, that massive forward jump can be really unwieldy, and while it's perfectly workable when you have lots of time and space, if you're under pressure or in tight quarters, it feels like the game wasn't even tested. Now, unfortunately, there's little saving grace for the game's glitches, which are particularly surprising considering Factor 5 was a very experienced studio with a history of technological wizardry. Items and enemies constantly clip out of bounds, assets pop in, and loading issues are rife. My game completely froze multiple times, which is a killer considering how much progress this can cause you to lose in the game's massive levels. The only theory for this instability that seems to hold any weight is that Infernal Machine made extensive use of the Nintendo 64 memory expansion pack. And potentially some sort of error in the code might be causing memory leaks, and this could be the source of the game's performance woes. Now, if I'm being totally honest, I could absolutely understand all of these issues being far too much for someone to get past. And if we're trying to be objective, there are certainly other games out there that do similar things with much more polish. But the thing is, there's just something charming about Infernal Machine. Something captivating about playing it that goes beyond traditional measures of quality. It's got memorable and funny characters, a surprisingly interesting story, and a level of ambition that's very hard to turn your nose up at. I mean, for God's sake, there's a level that is entirely based around driving a minecart, and while the game can barely handle what's being asked of it, it's impossible to hate a janky game that's been made out of love rather than laziness. Now that might be an appropriate place to leave our review, but we can't do that without talking about Infernal Machine's final few levels. Once Jones recovers the final Infernal Machine part, he ends up cornered between Volodnik and Havgood's employer, the CIA agent Simon Turner, and both parties demand that he hands over the keys to the power of Marduk. Clearly disturbed by their lack of respect for this ancient power, Jones is conflicted, but he ends up choosing Turner and Havgood thanks to his history with the Soviets. Incredibly, Volodnik isn't all that concerned, as he reveals that he's come to believe Marduk would likely destroy whoever awakens him in revenge for the destruction of his tower, and with that revelation, Indy sets off to try and stop Turner and save Havgood. This leads to a lengthy level inside of the Babylonian Infernal Machine that culminates with Turner managing to open a cross-dimensional portal and pushing Sophia in to act as a test subject. Obviously, Indy isn't going to let that fly, and he hunts down the rogue agent and puts a stop to his nonsense. Now, this is where things get really wacky, as while Indy tries to reverse the portal and save Havgood, he accidentally activates the machine and ends up falling through the gate into Marduk's realm. What follows is a level called the Aetherium, and it's one of the most kaleidoscopic, fever dream style levels I've ever experienced in any 3D adventure game, let alone in an Indiana Jones title. Instead of platforming between crumbling ledges, we're swimming through tunnels of pure energy. And instead of battling the forces of the Soviet Union, Indy finds himself under attack by a host of inhuman monsters. Where the game previously had its feet firmly planted on the ground, it concludes in the most abstract way imaginable, with Indy using a device called the Tool from the Beyond in order to open portals and travel between dimensions. The only thing that mars this insane sequence is that in the PC version, one of these portals would take you into the world of the Curse of Monkey Island, with Indy assuming the guise of Guybrush Threepwood and wandering around the barbershop. It's a wonderful Easter egg, and it's almost criminal that it was cut from the Nintendo 64 version. So eventually you come face to face with the demon god himself, and in a move that I'm sure nobody would have predicted at the start of this review, you bring him down by blasting the monster with energy leaking out of reality-bending portals, and then lashing him to death with your bullwhip after it's been supercharged with mystical demon energy. It's completely unhinged, and while it has almost nothing in common with the light historical fantasy of Spielberg and Lucas's blockbusters, I would be lying if I said it wasn't utterly captivating. For all of Infernal Machine's many and numerous faults, this rainbow of interdimensional nonsense is one of the best moments in Indy's video game career, and it's absolutely worth experiencing. As for the game's legacy, well, critics were pretty mixed on both versions, with an average score of around a 6 or 7 out of 10, depending on the outlet. Sales on PC were pretty respectable, but that console deal with Blockbuster really hampered its wider reputation. And ultimately, Infernal Machine has ended up as something of a hidden curio. It's not quite good enough to warrant nostalgic attention, but it's also not quite bad enough that it would develop any kind of infamy. Thankfully, the PC version is available on GOG.com, and while it's certainly inferior to the upgraded Nintendo 64 version, I'm simply happy that people are still able to play Barwood's take on interdimensional, Cold War era maximalist tomb raiding, even if the adventure doesn't always run smooth. Now, while there were substantial differences between the PC and Nintendo 64 versions of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, these are nothing compared to the gulf between those games and the obligatory portable demon. Over the course of the 1990s, portable gaming had exploded in popularity, largely driven by Nintendo's Game Boy, which was reasonably priced, had a great battery life, and sported a huge catalogue of quality games. It quickly outsold virtually every home console, and thanks to a young install base that wasn't particularly fussy, the portable market became a goldmine for publishers looking to turn a quick buck. By 1998, the original grey brick had been replaced with the Game Boy Color, and its more advanced hardware opened up the possibility for convincing console demakes, a trend which saw popular games reworked to function in battery-powered 8-bit. Now that might sound cynical, but this strategy produced some genuinely interesting games, and some companies poured real effort into their demakes, with titles like Mario Tennis, Metal Gear Solid, and Harvest Moon all matching up well to their console counterpart. Even when it didn't exactly work, these demakes are often worth exploring for just how interesting they can be. Take Rare's Perfect Dark, for example, a game that isn't remotely good, but has impressive pseudo-3D graphics and fully voiced cutscenes. Or Daikatana, the ill-fated Nintendo 64 shooter, which John Romero insisted be reimagined as a portable Zelda-like adventure game. Game Boy Color demakes are a treasure trove of confusing oddities and hidden gems. So what's the story with indie's own handheld Glodo? Well, its roots are unsurprisingly found in the Star Wars franchise, as in the year 2000, LucasArts had struck a deal with THQ, which allowed them to use the license when developing Game Boy Color games. The first release out of this agreement was Star Wars Episode 1, Obi-Wan's Adventures, a retelling of The Phantom Menace where you control the young Jedi from an isometric perspective and battle your way through a series of linear action levels. It's not exactly bad, but it's also not exactly good, and as this was developer HotGen's very first release, it's unsurprisingly a little rough around the edges. For THQ, this proved to be a bit of an issue, as they'd signed a deal with the new studio for them to produce all of their Game Boy games moving forwards. And while this is purely speculation, I think that they wanted them to sharpen up a little bit before using up more of their Star Wars contract. Therefore, with absolutely no evidence to support this, my theory is that this is what led to the creation of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine on the Game Boy Color. Now, considering the rather ignominious circumstances that led to this project, expectations that we might get one of those high-quality or curiosity-quenching demakes should really be tempered. In fact, Infernal Machine on the Game Boy Color is astoundingly bland, offering none of the quirk or charm found in its PC and console big brother. It's effectively the core ideas from Obi-Wan's Adventures pasted over Barwood's Babylonian epic. We've got the top-down perspective, the light platforming and the button mash combo, and just like before, it's all a very uneven experience. The most obvious issue is clear from the very first moments. There's absolutely zero storytelling, and the only context for anything that happens on screen is found exclusively in the game's manual, although even then it's skeletal at best. There's no Dr. Volodnik or Agent Turner, no musings about the nature of Marduk, no explanation about the pieces of the Infernal Machine, and Sophia Hapgood appears just twice and has virtually no dialogue. Moments like the game's finale and introduction have been filed down to the point where they're almost funny, with Indy greeting Sophia in his Canyonland camp before randomly attacking a Soviet base in the very next scene, or Marduk dying with zero explanation as to what it even is. This might seem harsh considering it's a Game Boy Color title, but Infernal Machine released in 2001, the same year as Lufia the Legend Returns, Pokemon Crystal and Oracle of Ages and Seasons. Nintendo's purple handheld was more than capable of weaving captivating tales, and HotGen had very little excuse for their paltry serving. Now, while the gameplay fares a little better, it's still nowhere near substantial enough, and again is missing most of what made the original interesting. Structurally, it's quite a faithful adaptation, taking you to most of the same locations and revolving entirely around that similar combination of combat, puzzle solving, swimming, and platforming. The issue is that it's just such a pale imitation, and HotGen has brought almost nothing creative to the table to make this stand out from the crowd. Take the combat. Instead of a wide arsenal of weapons that you have to carefully manage over multiple levels, you just have a pistol, and there isn't even an animation for firing, with hits only acknowledged by a distorted sound effect. The same goes for the inventory and shop, which now only stock health packs and anti-venom kits. And to be honest, after the first level, you'll be maxed out on both and never need to buy anything. Now, Obi-Wan Adventures made up for its janky gameplay by funneling everything through tightly designed linear levels. But here, HotGen have opted to try and replicate the maximalist level design of the original game, and it's a very poor fit for a handheld game. Levels like the Shambhala Temple and Tomb of Nub are once again structured as long series of complex puzzles that require lots of backtracking. And while this is frustrating on the Nintendo 64, it's absolutely draining on the repetitive screens of the Game Boy Color. The levels are just so drab to explore, and for some reason, there's absolutely no music whatsoever, which means the soundtrack to your confused wandering will just be this repetitive crack that is supposed to be in these footsteps. To be frank, it's just not very good. And despite THQ's hopes that HotGen would transform into a handheld licensed game powerhouse, the rest of the studio's history makes Obi-Wan Adventures and the Infernal Machine look like a relative hype. Amazingly, HotGen did return to the Star Wars license, as their next project was the Game Boy Advance remake of Jedi Power Battles, but somehow they managed to take this classic PlayStation and Dreamcast beat-em-up and transform it into a terrible isometric platform. From here, they embarked on a rampage of mediocre licensed releases like Barbie Pet Dream, Hot Wheels Extreme Racing, and Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX. For some reason, all this gave them the confidence to attempt home console development, and in 2003, they released Batman Dark Tomorrow for GameCube and Xbox, a horrific experience that's gone down in history as the worst Game game of all time. Astoundingly, they are still in business, although according to their LinkedIn page, the company now only has 2 employees, and it seems like they primarily deliver games on the Apple Store, and haven't made anything since 2013. Now, what's particularly frustrating about all this isn't the game itself, but the way that LucasArts was happy to treat one of its marquee franchises. Too many times Indiana Jones had been handed out to cheap and untested studios, or used as